Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Marmara Urban Forum meeting, the second Marmara Urban Forum meeting, panel on walking the fine line between privacy and security. My name is Ceren Sezer. I'm a research associate here at RVTA, Chair of Urban Design, and I will be moderating this great panel, who will be speaking from various locations in Europe, in Aachen, in Utrecht, in the Netherlands, and in the States, from New York, Brooklyn. And we are online via Zoom all around the world. So we will have some questions by the end of our session. Then you can write questions in the Q&A session, and also you can raise your hand. As you might know, the focus of MARUF meeting this year is about global challenges and how urban conditions change under the drastic influence of climate change, wars, and flooding, and fire, and so on and forth. So in our panel, we will have a specific focus on public space, more specifically public life, how public space is influenced by these drastic changes. And more specifically, we will focus on security, safety aspect, in which we will discuss public space from, on the one hand, as a private space, and on the other hand, as a public space. So how security and safety concerns actually defines these two ends of public space spectrum. And for that, we bring great experts together tonight, this morning, and from different sectors, but basically from urban design and planning. So I would like to introduce our panel. I'd like to begin a follow alphabetical order. I'd like to begin with Ethan Kent. Hi, Ethan. Hello. He is Executive Director of Placemaking X, and Ethan is joining us from New York. He works to support public space organizations, projects, and leadership around the world to build a global placemaking movement. He traveled a lot to more than 1,000 cities and 60 countries to advance the cause of leading urban development with inclusive public spaces and placemaking strategies. In 2019, he co-founded Placemaking X Network. Actually, he established it on Project for Public Spaces campaign. So we will hear more about your work, Ethan, today. And our second speaker, Viviana Cordero, she's the CEO of Huasichanga. Sorry for pronunciation. I studied it via Viviana, but I made mistakes. Sorry about it. She's working daily to plan cities hand in hand with children, youngest population of our cities. And she develops with children strategies to add play aspect to urban environment. Viviana is a lawyer, and she is urban planning specialist, driven by the concepts of social, environmental, and intergenerational justice. And currently, she is also pursuing her PhD research at University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And our third speaker, Christa Reicher, she is professor and director of Chair and Institute of Urban Design and European Urbanism in RWTH Aachen University in Germany. Christa is also co-founder and owner of Reicher Hase Architect and Urban Planning Office. She works very well established both in practice and also in research. And currently she is the head of spatial development of North Rhine-Westphalia region of Germany. So to give a bit idea about the outline of our session, we have in total 1 hour. So we would like to give word to each of our speakers, something like 10 to 12 minutes. And after 3 presentations, we would like to start our Q&A sessions, and we are expecting tough questions. So please don't be shy to raise your questions. You are more than welcome. And then we will wrap up our session, and we will close it before a few minutes before 6 o'clock. So I would like to invite Professor Christa Reicher for her presentation. Christa, please. If you please share your screen.
Okay, good evening. Welcome to this session. My presentation has the title Between Reanimation and Animation Challenges and Planning Strategies in Dealing with Public Space. Debates about the future of cities and urban growth are inseparably from debates about public space and public sphere, both in the theoretical discourse and in the practice of city planning. So architects and city planners, politicians, and civic activists, researchers, and public relations specialists are all aware about the significance of public space as a kind of backbone and face of a quarter, of a city, or also in the scale of the region. So the grammar of the city as well as the rules of public space are changing permanently to the needs of the society and the demographic situation. So the range of public spaces is the result of different trends. And I want to point out what trends are now really important for us. So on the one hand, we have the demographic and social change. And you can see how the elder generation is influencing our acting and our planning strategy. And we have more than during the last periods, the climate change, even in our region. We could see in July of this year how streets and public space was destroyed by the big flood disasters. And we have a kind of globalization, which is changing our society and our public space. Here you have a picture of the city of Dortmund, where the refugees in 2016 occupied our public space and said, this is also our space and we want to use the space as we want to use it. And it is digitalization, and you can see how the digitalization is influencing not only our behavior, but also the shape of our city. So urban planning has to deal with all these different challenges and concerns and has to develop short-term and long-term solutions regarding the different scales. So, and I want to show you some planning strategies out of our planning office. So the first project is dealing with a kind of public ground, and it was a project, a competition for Berlin. Perhaps you all know the closed airport in Tegel, and we won this competition for a new development for industrial and office uses. And the concept was to define and to design public spaces and traffic spaces which were somehow usable for everybody and not only classical streets. So we had the task to show how the pedestrian, the public transportation and the private transportation could use these kind of new public spaces as a kind of public ground floor. So this is a project which is now under development, and we will see how the public spaces, also with autonomic cars and so on, will work at the end when this project is realized. The second project is a kind of qualification of boundaries between public space and the built area. And the case is Tempelhofer Feld in Berlin. Perhaps you know this huge old airport. And our task was to develop housing and a library to define somehow the border between the open space on the one hand, the landscape, and on the other hand, the built area. But the project was stopped because people had the feeling when we start building at the border, this will be the first stop, this is the first step to rebuild the whole landscape and the whole area of the Tempelhofer Feld. So, but it was interesting because we were really discussing what are the boundaries between the built environment and the open environment. So the third and the last project is looking to the Ruhr region, where we worked on different scales, uses, and strategies. As I worked at the university in Dortmund and together with my planning office, we made a lot of research and analyzing the whole area of the Ruhr region. And what was really impressive was that this is a region which is really determined by a huge network of streets. But what was interesting during the European Capital of Culture in 2010, the politicians decided to use the motorway as a kind of public space, the longest picnic which took place in the whole world than ever. So, and this was a really big experience to change traffic space into a public and communicating space. But I want to point out how necessary this regional scale is regarding public space. We worked on the green corridors, which are running in the north-south direction in the Ruhr region, and asked us how to qualify these green corridors and how to link the built neighborhoods to the open space to strengthen the accessibility of the public space and the greenery. So with this in mind, I want to show you that these various examples and urban development projects show you how the layout of public space is strongly influencing city and urban development as a whole and the other way around, through emphasizing the notion that public space is a kind of indicator to life quality. It is important to differentiate between spatial conditions, categories of public space, and strategies in the sense of animation and reanimation of public space. And I want to point out that it is really important to think about how to integrate the various forms and phases of public space into a whole, because we have on the one hand open green, we have temporarily installations of space and programs for a long-term strategy and an intermediate strategy. And it does not have to be an either or policy, but a better balance between public interests on the one hand and private enterprises on the other hand. So to balance this means, and I want to end up with the words of Charles Laundrie, who is focusing on the so-called learning city. The kind of city is more than a city of well-educated people. A learning city is a clever city that reflects upon itself, learns from failure, and is strategic, and it is open to all kinds of resources. So public space is such a kind of resource. I want to point out that before we plan and design concepts of public space, let us discuss about how we want to live in the future. And if we have a vision about our way of living, I'm sure we will find conceiving strategies and concepts for public space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris Reicher. Now I would like to invite our second speaker, Ethan Kent.
So hi, everyone. Thank you, Saren, and thank you, Krista, for that wonderful overview of the context within which we're all working. Really honored to be part of this conversation. Really admired it, and certainly the Marmara region is such a special region to have this conversation. And I want to start with quickly a story of my first experience going there to Istanbul. Actually, it was 1996. I was 20 years old, and I got on the wrong ferry crossing the Bosphorus. And it turned out to be the last ferry of the day. And I just arrived in Istanbul. I'd never been to Asia before. So this was my first experience actually getting to Asia by accident. And I was nervous, hadn't traveled that much before, arrived on the other side of the Bosphorus, the Asian side, and started asking people if there was a way to get back. And luckily found a fisherman in a very old wooden boat that was willing to take me back across. So it was that kind of welcoming nature of a city, to feel safe in a place that feels foreign, was really transformative for me, and led to a lot more traveling in that region and elsewhere in the world as well. But in a way, our work on public spaces and placemaking actually really started with safety and sort of a different angle on addressing safety issues that still needs to be further uncovered. And we've also made some mistakes in this approach as well. But in the sort of the placemaking movement really has roots in the sort of 70s and 80s in the US, at a time when downtowns were being disinvested in and were perceived as very unsafe spaces, and often were as well. And sort of the unique approach that my father, who actually started the work founded Project for Public Spaces and worked with a man named William White, who sort of developed the theory behind this. But my father really applied these approaches to many downtowns across the US, of trying to make a place that's attractive to everybody else, rather than trying to design out undesirable activity or what's perceived as undesirable activity, trying to invite in different populations and making everyone feel welcome. And then actually about 10 years ago, our work with UN Habitat to make public spaces and placemaking a global cause really again started with the Safer Cities program there. So addressing these issues in different contexts. But we've often found, whether it's at a human scale or citywide scale or national scale, the best way to often address any crisis, but especially a safety crisis, is to bring in many other disciplines, many other causes, to make places work on many different dimensions. If we're just trying to get out negative activity, you're not addressing the root causes, but you're also not addressing the root opportunities for those spaces and the people that they're meant to serve. So the future of cities right now, though, the imagery is often about these sort of spaces that may be perceived to be safe, but we're very concerned that the design and management of these public spaces will not lead to safe spaces. But even if they do, it's a safety that may be precluding use from many different populations that can help make them work better, that are not being served, that have been left out of our public spaces, our cities, our local economies. Indeed, there are, especially here in the US with the Black Lives Matter movement and others, there's many equity-seeking groups that are seeing how many safety agendas are undermining the roles of them actually feeling safe in those spaces, and there's also good discussions right now about how healthy public spaces feel a little unsafe sometimes. It's not that we need a baseline of safety for people to feel welcome there, especially more vulnerable groups and women and children and so forth. But there's also a full spectrum. I love the title of this. You need privacy. You need spaces where you feel totally safe. But a healthy city has a full spectrum of public to private. And in the most informal, the most public spaces, we do feel a little vulnerable to an extent. And some of that can be healthy, and we need to explore and embrace that discussion as well. But we're not enabling that discussion or realizing the potential of publicness the way we're currently planning our cities. We're leading with design, a narrow idea of design and development, not with public spaces, not with places. We're defining the future of our cities around architectural objects, not places. I took this picture of the Guggenheim Bilbao, actually on my honeymoon, and had a few moments to quickly see it. And I took this picture to illustrate a quote by William White, who again was the mentor of Project for Public Spaces and my father. He said that So that actually blank walls proclaim the power of the institution, the inconsequence of the individual for whom they are clearly meant to put down or intimidate. Moments after I took this picture, these two men actually mugged a tourist couple of their camera. And I told police, and they said, people get mugged right here all the time. Indeed, this space is designed perfectly for that pattern of activity. It can be dominated by this user group. People can hide, and there's tourists that go by here all the time. But as you go away from this space, it actually feels much safer, much more vibrant.
Şimdi siz bu alanlarda bulunduğunuz sürece böyle şeylerle karşılaşabiliyorsunuz.
Another type, I hear some background noise. But another type of safety that is often of even greater concern
Bir başka mesele de şuydu ki genellikle daha fazla
and we don't realize we've taken for
çıkan
granted that we have to deal with of cars and traffic, but that is something that we feel in our bones every day, crossing streets, not feeling welcome. And so we want to make sure that's included in it. And again, the way we're planning cities, especially in developing parts of the world, are perpetuating many of the big mistakes we've made in the US and around the world. This is New Jersey, but unfortunately, this is the type of traffic pattern that we're inducing all over the world. Times Square, we led a campaign to reinvent the city's most dangerous spaces around places people can gather, and it's amazingly inexpensive and simple to do experiments with this. And then once people feel like what it's like to be relaxed in a public space, to feel safe in a public space like this, it changes everything. And again, in your bones, you feel it. The city we've actually worked the most in state of Detroit. I was actually here last week, and we did a big conference in Flint, city parts of the country that have major crime issues, but also have other safety issues. But the new narratives that are emerging there are of people able to shape their public realm. They're not the most livable cities by any means, and the governments aren't delivering livability, but they're delivering lovability. They're delivering the opportunities for people to shape their cities and build them from the grassroots up and feel welcome in them, and do it in a much more resourceful and actually much more economical way. So what is placemaking? It's a collaborative process by which we can shape our public realm in order to maximize shared value. And we really see that leading with shared value as a goal is turning upside down the dominant model of urbanization, where the dominant model is extracting from shared value and really perpetuating the privatization of the public realm. And again, we need private spaces, but we need a full spectrum of public to private. And when shared value is increased, you have that blurred, sort of porous, open city that enables that. And most importantly, you build these places build human connections. They build social capital. They build capacity to shape the public realm more responsively, more actively, more democratically, in ways that really can more systemically address root causes to safety and inequality in a community. So the roots of the placemaking movement are in the work of Jane Jacobs and William White in the 50s, 60s. When my father started working with them, and the Street Life Project, he founded Project for Public Spaces in 1975. And we first started using the word placemaking in the sort of mid to late 90s, when we realized that the biggest impact we were having wasn't sort of our expertise, but the respect for the community's expertise and the tools that we were developing to draw out and support their inquiry into public spaces and how they can improve them. So placemaking, the first principle of placemaking is that the community is the expert, and we need to support that. And and we'll hear from Viviana, who's a leading placemaker, around the world, on how she's actually applying this, more. I'm not going to have a chance to go into more detail, but we saw the sort of placemaking movement start to go global in the early 2000s, and we started really organizing it as a global network with UN Habitat and with, around 2011, 12, 13, with a couple conferences we organized in Detroit and Stockholm and Nairobi, Buenos Aires, and elsewhere, then we saw the movement really self-organize, which was always the goal, with leadership, like Viviana, organizing around cross-cutting issues, around regional networks. There's now almost 20 regional placemaking networks. We even did a conference you can see in China. So we launched Placemaking X to really just highlight and connect the placemaking learning, advocacy, and impact that's happening around the world. But it was founded, the movement was really founded with the idea that everyone has the right to live in a great place, but more importantly, everyone has the right to contribute to making the place where they already live great. So we need to, the crisis is a capacity of crisis a crisis of capacity of everyone to help shape the public realm, to co-create it. We can't just have experts doing it. Even if we have the right solutions, we need to create more demand, more capacity for implementing them. So these are some of the conferences that have really helped shape the movement, the conversation globally, and have grown networks that are continuing today. And while placemaking has slightly different meanings around the world, the strengths and weaknesses of it actually help inform it and help prevent it from being co-opted by any one sector, discipline, ideology, demographic. So it's part of the placemaking process is really unpacking what it means, who should be shaping the public realm, how are we doing it in an inclusive way, who are we doing it for? So the network was really set up to, to highlight and connect the leadership, balance it out, and keep going where it's not, help facilitate it moving where, people may not be included as much. There's a placemaking week happening in Africa later this year. We've a growing network there. There's an American placemaking network that represents the Arab world. Placemaking in Europe is a very active network. So the Marmara region can be involved in any of these, which is exciting. And we encourage people to get connected to them. Glad to connect with people individually. We just, earlier this week, we had a network, we have quarterly network meetings with the leaders of all these networks to share their updates. Right now, we're engaged in what's called a porch placemaking week, where people are talking about how to turn institutions inside out, how to reconnect to their public realm coming out of the pandemic, how everyone can be a placemaker around the world and do small things that lead up to big change. So the mission of Placemaking X is to be a global network of leaders who together accelerate placemaking as a way to create healthy, inclusive, and beloved communities. And our vision is to make the spaces we live into the places we love, to create a thriving, equitable, and sustainable world through the convergence of values, passion, and action around our public spaces. So it's always about advocating for systemic change, because impacts in public spaces can perpetuate the status quo if we're not challenging it. We need to amplify the leadership, the small things that are happening around the world, and we need to connect and amplify impact. We need to really make sure public spaces, it's not just about changing public spaces, but turning upside down the development model to attract investment in people on the terms of local communities in ways that add to public spaces. Create this virtuous cycle of placemaking that we call it. So a quick tool to applying this is the power of 10. And this is just the example here is in New York, where a lot of our early projects were in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but we really think you need to learn. Unfortunately, people copy the design or the form of great public spaces, not the process and the management often. And so places like the High Line, Bryant Park, and others, there's a lot to learn from more the process. And in each case, the community was often against something before it was for something, but it used that energy to be that negative energy of sometimes what people call NIMBYism, and moved it to be for an alternative, for a great public space. And those same people are often involved in helping to manage and govern these spaces. In 1980, my father actually did a master plan of Bryant Park, doing a lot of user analysis and outreach for the people there, including the homeless populations in the park. But the approach was to bring in positive activity, not to push them out, to make them a part of it in some cases, or to not dominate it any longer. But it's at this human scale that the magic really happens. So focusing on the uses and activities helps inform and drive demand for design changes and management and programmatic changes to the space. And so these are places, there was drug dealing here, but they kind of joke that they replaced the crack and cocaine with coffee and ice cream. And at that time, that it really helped address a lot of the underlying safety and security issues to the space. So to close, you can also apply this idea globally. We encourage everyone to look at how they can improve, add a use to a certain place. They can create a place with 10 things to do in it, in front of their home or institution. They can look at how they can create a great destination. Really, that's what anchors and starts to get placemaking going in a city, is when you create a great destination with 10 places in it, a public market, a square, a waterfront destination. And great cities, we think, should have the goal of creating 10 major destinations, each with 10 things to do in it. And through that, that's how we think New York most transformed itself and its perception locally and globally. And then we'd like to, highlight the countries that are really leading this place-led approach and how they're leading it. Places, like Ecuador, where Viviana's from, are leading these conversations. But so we think, placemaking times Istanbul times the Marmara district can really lead to global impact. So we look forward to connecting with people from that region. And often there are a lot of people in this region working on these issues, but often connecting them can be very valuable, and then helping connect them with people globally that are dealing with similar challenges as well. Or if they're dealing with issues of youth and children and play, then Viviana is one of the leaders of that conversation globally. So we were really set up through our collaboration with UN Habitat by one colleague, Cecilia Martinez, who said, we're creating a global movement to shape spaces into places. If we're just creating public space, it's vulnerable to privatization, to negative safety and security issues. But if we're trying to add purpose and meaning to space and allow the communities that they serve to shape them, we can most fundamentally address the safety and security goals of the city. So we encourage you to stay in touch with Placemaking X, and glad to help connect you with people working on these issues all over the world to further this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ethan. I think thank you for introducing Placemaking Movement, and I'm sure your invitation will be very welcomed. And hopefully in the maybe next Marmara Forum, which will be on site. So it is I think, great opportunity and energy rather than meeting only in an online platform. Now I would like to invite our third speaker of our panel, Viviana Cordera from Huasipichanga. Viviana, please share your screen. And before you tell about your work, I'm really curious about the meaning of the meaning of the name of your company or organization.
Yeah.
Maybe you can start from there.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it's actually a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am sure we put a big challenge in pronouncing Huasipichanga, but you did it really well. And yeah, what it actually means is in Ecuador, we were founded there, and in Ecuador, the indigenous communities, they work together to build their houses. So you wouldn't build your house on your own or for your family, but your whole neighborhood will actually help you. Or let's say tomorrow we build Ethan's house and then mine, and together we do this. And the Huasipichanga is the word for the celebration that it's done in the community the day that you finish the house, the day that you can inaugurate the house. So this really represents what we want to do. We want to work always collaboratively with the community, and this also probably shows a little bit also about how we feel being part of Placemaking X. It's a very collaborative network, and I think that is so great about the movement and about the vision that we are trying to lead in the world, because it's not a competition between different professionals, but always how can we collaborate to create better public spaces. So yeah, I mean, for us, it's also very nice to, if other people is interested and want to collaborate with us, that is the meaning and the spirit of what we do. And yeah, today, well, I want to talk a little bit about the security and safety in urban public spaces, but most specifically from the perspective of child-friendly cities. How is it for children to be in the public space? Is it safe? What is that experience, and how has it changed over time? So I really like this picture from 1946, where we can see really children occupying the space, feeling that the public space is there. And as well in 1960, where they are skating in the middle of the road. And it's very interesting to think, like, if I'm a parent nowadays, if I would let my children go out and play like this on the street. So I think, like, were parents at that time not that careful about children's safety? And are we now very obsessed with it that now parents have children on leashes. I want to think that no, it's not the parenting style that is responsible of these cultural shifts, but it's mostly the way we create our public spaces. So this is a street here in Utrecht where I'm based, and children bike around, they play around. It's really a place where they can feel safe, and also their parents feel that they're safe. But this was definitely not the case I think I went one extra, a few decades ago, right? When actually the space was prioritized for cars. So the designers, the urban planners, the policymakers, the politicians have a very big responsibility on the way we shape our spaces for children to feel safe, and for their caretakers as well to feel that they could independently move around. And the big question that I want to pose today is, have we sacrificed children's development for their security? And the short answer is yes, sadly we have. We most of the time prefer or have built schools where children live like this, like in prisons, like in cages, where the more secluded they are, then we think they are in a safer space. But science and research has recently proven the opposite. To give you two examples, children that, for instance, play in a playground that is flat, a very specific flat concrete ground, or sometimes even sponge ground for them to feel safe and not to be hurt if they fall, for example, those children don't develop physically the same muscles that a children develops if he or she has the chance to run in a mountain or to climb a tree. So we are actually hindering their physical development, thinking that we care about their safety. Another very sad example actually of this is that many parents decide to drive their children to the school and leave them exactly at the door of the school because they think that is safer for them. However, the biggest reason or the biggest cause of death of children are traffic accidents. And the second one is asthma and other illness that come from the pollution of the cars of the same parents that are causing this traffic because they think it's safer to go and leave their children at the door of the school. So the challenge is not only spatial, the challenge is cultural, the challenge is social, and Ethan already said this as well, but I think it's very important to look at it from a very holistic and interdisciplinary perspective. And the pandemic has shown this very well. We know now that children, of course, they can go to classes online, they can play online, but they really need to play outside and they need the public space. And just to show you an example, 4 generations ago, a child was able to really walk around a big area, while today the average child can walk alone only for 300 meters. That's the best scenario. And the child-friendly movement is actually advocating to at least allow most of the children to walk independently or move around independently for 600 meters. So the pandemic also gave us a new opportunity that was looking at the empty streets and what can we do with them. And it really brought joy to children, but it also brought a really new way for us to reimagine how the public space can be occupied. Now, how to do it? I just want to show you a very brief example of one project that we are doing in Ecuador that it's called You Also Build Cuenca. And what we do in this project is that we use the methodology of urban pedagogy to children in high schools what is urbanism, what is the public space, what is active mobility, how that influences their lives. And with those concepts, we also teach them about placemaking, for example. And with those concepts, they identify themselves, what are the issues around their schools and how can they propose solutions, and we actually implement them together. So in this case, they actually noticed that the traffic was the biggest issue that they had around the school, and then decided to create in this 600-meter buffer safe interventions and safe routes for them to walk from different points where their parents could drop them off and pick them up. And we created different safe routes from those hop-on, hop-off stations. What this means is that if we analyze an area and we do that in one school, we have a safe buffer for children. But if we map all the schools of that area and do something similar, it means we can have a child-friendly city where children can move around safely and independently. And I want to show you this quick video of what they did and how they've been working on it to create these zones. And of course, we are working closely with the municipality for them to take over and pass it from a temporary intervention into something long-term, improving the crossings, for example, or widening the sidewalks. But all these came from the children themselves, also working, of course, with the community around. And we teach the children that they are able to make decisions, but also we teach them about how important it is that also the neighborhood feels safe and feels happy about their interventions. So they have performed different surveys, asking, for example, the neighbors that live there, how do they feel about having a school? And of course, some say that yes, the street is very busy and dangerous, and others love the school around. But the perception of safety for the people around the school is actually quite high. And for the students themselves, they are very happy and they feel safe if they can walk to the school. Now they feel even safer, they say, because they know the neighbors. So we have this concept of eyes on the street, right? The neighbors also know which children are going to the school, should we take care about from them, you know? And I think that this is very important, especially in a context like Ecuador, where children don't go to the school that is in their specific neighborhood, but they can choose any school in the city. And very briefly, I want to show you this video. When we were talking about safety, we filmed this video with a drone. And we thought, well, what happens if a children gets kidnapped on the way, for example, right? So we're working actually closely with police agents to be around. And the spatial intervention is almost a tool to change that behavior of mobility, to allow them to have the opportunity to change their security perception into saying, yeah, this could be a safe place. But in that, we also found this idea of what if the zone would always be, always have drones that are surveilling the place. And actually the zone has now cameras from the police. But this brought to me in the frame of what we're talking today, this idea, or do we really feel safe when we are under the drones, or are we exposed to something else? And we've been talking about this debate of privacy. So I wanted to shortly mention this project that is called Future Collider from the artist Tomo Kihara that I really encourage you to see, where he actually imagines how the city is going to be in 50 years and what are the signs that we are going to have in the city, right? Like, for example, one goes to, okay, you have 20 hours drone checking that everything's safe, but the other one is like, this neighborhood is drone free, so you actually don't need to hide your face, for example, because nobody is looking. So I think it's really interesting to go to that debate as well. And the use of technology, I think it's very useful, especially if we think about smart cities. But of course, it has also disconnected us. So Wasipichanga and also together with Tomo, we created this game, thinking how can phones be used to connect people physically and not digitally. And I'm gonna briefly show you this video. That mainly it's how can you stay connected with your phone? So one person has to touch it on one side, the other on the other side, and it's like, well, you have to hold your fingers for a long time to see how long can you really stay connected. So I think that the way we think about public space, but also about security, safety, and privacy is changing, is evolving. And the most important thing is that we think about it constantly and question it constantly. Yeah, and in that sense, probably the real risk to our security is to lose this human connection. And I hope that through placemaking, through this different way of seeing urban and public spaces, we can keep that connection. Thank you very much.
Dear Viviana, thanks a lot for this interesting presentation and also the stories projects that you presented. So we have started with overall view of what are the current challenges in our city with the presentation of Krista, from social demographic changes to climate change to digitalization. And then Krista showed some examples from her practice. And then Ethan followed her by presenting how place-making movements developed around with the ambition of making cities more safe, more inclusive, and more connected. And Viviana, you gave a brilliant presentation on how to achieve it with a specific focus group, in this case, children. So I would like to ask our audience if they have any questions for our speakers to start with. And I see one question in chat. This is for Viviana. You can also read it perhaps. So he or she says, I study about safer cities. So would you like to advise, can you advise me any institute or center of Europe for working about safer cities?
It's a very good question. I have to be honest, I don't know the answer by heart on somebody that's specifically working on safer cities. I know that, well, the European Commission has different programs, and lately they recently launched something about smart cities and thinking about this line between privacy and safety. So maybe you can take a look at that, but also I think it's worth taking a look at the Placemaking Europe movement, because we have so many people working on so many different fields that I'm pretty sure you can find someone in our webpage that works on that field specifically.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from our speakers? If not, I would like to, also considering our time limitation, I would like to know more about how do you work with communities? And this is a question first I would like to start with Krista, because you work in very different setting. You have your clients either from private or public developer. So working with communities and including them to the process of project development. Oh, she's not here, by the way. I just noticed. I guess she dropped out. Let me see. Okay, so I don't see Krista on my screen at least, right? I'm not wrong. Then I'd like to raise this question to Ethan. So you brought these three aspects that advocate, amplify, and accelerate. So could you please a bit explore or tell us more on how you develop these three pillars of working with communities and developing placemaking projects? Very briefly, please, due to our time limitation.
Sure. Thanks, Saren. So, the first 20 years or so of my career was actually leading placemaking projects in communities, in hundreds of communities around the world and in 60 countries, looking at different challenges, but safety and security was often a fundamental one. But I will say that the safer cities angle, we do have to, I've met a lot of people that work on safer cities much more macroly, on a more macro level, which is also really important. And the Safer Cities program at UN Habitat is really extraordinary in how they're addressing safety issues citywide, building capacity, working with police forces and other, and looking at economic issues as well. So looking at it holistically is also really important. And they've also wonderfully embraced sort of our approach to really, as Viviana talked about, it's through building social connection, through building social capital, through bringing positive activity to spaces, addressing it more effectively. So the placemaking campaigns in cities, really are about highlighting who's doing that well, highlighting how it's being done in low-income parts of the city and wealthier parts, how it's connecting the people doing this work, telling their stories, and then figuring out what's working and investing more in those approaches. A lot of the best placemaking, especially the most fundamentally addresses safety issues, is done to what we call lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of valuable work that's been done around CPTED, crime prevention for environmental design, but that often focuses on more the physical aspects, which are valid, but we think a placemaking lens is a little more holistic in that it looks at the community, the contexts, and more the uses and programmatic activations that you can start doing in a more temporary basis. Some of the examples that Viviana showed, that can experiment, build momentum, test. You can make some mistakes in this sort of lower cost approach. So a lot of it is we suggest doing lots of small actions and connecting those small actions to create broader impact. And then, when things work, you can invest in more fundamentally in public space infrastructure as well. But that sort of campaign is focusing on the small actions, building the learning network and the advocacy network behind it, and then looking at making sure you're addressing the systemic change, from the economic context, the larger cultural and racial inequality that's structural in many parts of the world, and how public space can actually be a really positive and constructive way to address these issues, to show people having a more pluralistic experience in public space, to show joy from marginalized groups in public space, to show how they can bridge difference. And that's really, in these public spaces, that's really how you change culture, which is ultimately the goal of these campaigns, is to change the culture of how people use public spaces, how they feel safe in them, how they are co-creators of that spaces, and all take responsibility for the safety of each other in a public space.
Thank you, Ethan. You describe it so nicely and so smoothly, as if, it is a very easy process. There are like clear steps and you go one after each other, and I'm sure it is not like that. That's why I want to jump to Viviana's speech. So what are the most challenging situations that you face when you work with children, when you work with municipalities? We have also a few questions in the chat. I'll like to give them space too. So very briefly, Viviana, I'm sorry for the time limitation.
No worries. I think the biggest challenge is time. We wish that this would happen faster, but working with communities, working with people takes time, and that's okay. We need to give everybody the chance to embrace the process, to be part of it. And I think if we want to do it faster, we could have gone there, painted the circles and say, yeah, here's the route you have to walk. But that's not what we want, right? We want the children to know why are they walking. We want the parents to know also why. We want the municipality to take it to a different level. So I think that the biggest challenge is to embrace that idea that a collaborative process takes a little bit more time to make this final change.
And you are aware of the work of Bernard van Leer Foundation, right? In Den Haag? If not, I'll tell you later on. They work with children and they have a program which is called Urban 95. Perhaps you heard of that.
Yes, and I've seen the great work they've been doing, especially in Istanbul. So I think it's definitely worth following that process.
Definitely. And now they are collaborating with London School of Economics on the same theme of Urban 95. But I'd like to jump to our questions in the chat. And Ethan, you mentioned placemaking. How is privacy located in your work?
So how does privacy connect? No, really good question. And so, you know, I mentioned how I think healthy cities have a full spectrum of private to public space. And, you know, in really good public spaces, people can have that, they can sit on the edge of a space and feel protected, feel a certain degree of safety as they come into it. And then often as you go into the space, you're increasingly part of you're on display in a sense. You're less private and you're more public, and and you see how people, you know, different personalities want different things. Different people that feel more vulnerable want to move to different spaces, but they all benefit in some ways from the people that are getting into a more public experience. They like to watch people. They like to to see people being informal. They like to watch children, you know, having fun, and it slowly relaxes everybody and makes everyone feel part of a more public space. But you know, but the problems actually really occur when there's big divides, when there's big drop-offs, when there's gated communities, when there's walled areas, when there's all of a sudden people are thrown out into a space and they don't feel safe and comfortable. They're not. So it's that continuum from public to private is really key. And that's also what I think when there's these big divides between different groups, different classes, wealth inequalities, different races, that's often, I think, what contribute to and perpetuate some of the underlying problems behind crime and you know, and perceived and real safety issues. So having these conversations is really key, asking people where they feel safe, where they don't, but then unpacking how what the outcomes of safety, the social connections that Viviana talked about, the places where people feel really comfortable and joyful, how do we achieve those spaces at the center of many communities? We've actually applied that power of 10 and this approach to like different you know, informal settlements, like in Rio, where there's different in some of the it shows that the same physical layout of a city can have very different outcomes. Or of a informal settlement. Some of them are very safe, and it's a function more of the informal governance and how people compete to contribute to their shared spaces, than more than the physical aspects of it. So you can't look at an urban design plan and say if it's safe or not. You have to look at how people own it, manage it, how they, you know, the sort of eyes on the street is mentioned, but it's really it's almost softer than that too. It's how people feel like they're all co-creators of that space. They all feel welcome to take responsibility for each other's safety in a space.
And Viviana, do you think that smart cities will influence privacy in public space? The smart cities or smart technologies, let's call it, or the idea of this smart cities or whatever affiliated with that. And you have only 40 seconds for a brief answer.
I think it's already a big debate, and I think that the biggest question is who is controlling and who is designing those technologies. So as we have had this debate of who is designing the street for so long, or who is designing the public space, we also need to understand who is designing these algorithms, these technologies, because Ethan mentioned before, for example, in the United States, there are communities like Latinos, Black communities that already feel unsafe in a space because of the police, for example. So now we could also feel unsafe because we don't know who is behind those cameras that are supposedly giving us safety. And I think that's going to be the biggest debate for smart cities currently.
And as you already imply, this debate also requires more time for discussion and a more deeper discussion, but unfortunately our time is finished for this session. It was great to have you, Ethan Ken, and Viviana Cordera. I'm very happy to meet you. It is an online platform, and we have this opportunity to present your work with a wider public. So we would like to thank to Marmara Urban Forum for inviting us, providing us this platform. And we hope that next time there will be longer time and a more interactive session in which we can develop on these topics, because indeed it is a deep topic and there is a lot to discuss about and know about each other's work and bring this efforts further. So thank you very much to both of you. Unfortunately, we lost Krista Reicher on the way, but we also like to thank her. Have a good evening and have a good day, Ethan. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Enjoyed it.